She only had $8 left, enough to feed her daughter in the morning. But that night, she saw a dying biker on the pavement, and made a choice that would change her life forever. The fluorescent lights above the gas station flickered like tired eyes trying to stay awake. It was close to midnight, the air still and heavy, the kind of quiet that made every small sound echo louder than it should. Sienna Clark stood beside a rusty pump, her uniform stained with coffee and grease from another double shift. In her hand, 8 crumpled dollars. Her last 8. Tomorrow's breakfast money for her little girl. She counted them once, twice, as if somehow they might turn into more. But they didn't. She sighed, tucked them into her pocket, and started toward the restroom. That's when she heard it, a sharp metallic clang, then a low groan, the kind that cuts through bone. She turned. Under the harsh white glow, a massive man lay sprawled beside his Harley, one hand clawing at his chest. His leather vest was covered in patches, the skull and wings of the Hell's Angels bright against the black. His face was pale, his breath jagged. He was dying. "Hey," she called out instinctively. From the doorway, the gas station clerk shouted back, "Don't get involved, lady. Those guys mean trouble." The words sliced through the night like a warning bell. Sienna froze. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Every instinct screamed to walk away. She thought of Maya, 6 years old, sleeping soundly in their tiny apartment, unaware that her mother was standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing left but $8 and a choice. Sienna looked at the man again. His fingers twitched weakly against the concrete, his lips turning a frightening shade of blue. "He's having a heart attack," she murmured. The clerk shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "Then he's in the wrong line of work. Walk away, lady." She took one step back, then stopped. Her hand brushed the $8 in her pocket. She could almost see Maya at the breakfast table, empty bowl in front of her, big brown eyes asking softly, "Mommy, are we out of milk again?" The image hit her harder than the wind. Her grandmother's voice rose from memory, calm, unshakable. "Kindness costs nothing, baby. Sometimes it's all we got." Sienna's pulse quickened. She looked around, no one else was coming. The night had gone still again, as if waiting for her decision. The clerk leaned against the doorframe, watching, curious. "You're wasting your time," he said. She ignored him. The silence stretched long enough to feel like forever. Then, with a sudden breath, Sienna turned and ran into the store. The clerk frowned as she rushed past the aisles, grabbed a bottle of aspirin, a bottle of water, and slammed them on the counter. "How much?" she demanded. $6.50. She handed over the $8, grabbed the change without counting, and bolted out the door. The man was still there, barely moving now. She dropped to her knees, the asphalt rough beneath her palms. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes flickered open for a split second. Nothing coherent came out, just a faint wheeze. She twisted the cap off the aspirin, poured 2 tablets into her hand, opened the water, and lifted his head gently. "Chew these," she said, voice trembling but steady. "Please. Chew." His jaw moved slowly, painfully. She held the bottle to his lips. "Good, that's it. Breathe. Stay with me." The man's breathing steadied slightly. His massive hand reached out and clutched hers with surprising strength. His skin was cold. His eyes found hers, gray and glassy. "What's your name?" he rasped. "Sienna. Sienna Clark." His grip tightened. "Tell them. Hawk sent you." The words barely made it out before his eyes rolled back and the sirens began to wail in the distance. Sienna stayed there, her hand still in his, $8 gone, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know who this man was. She didn't know that her choice tonight would ripple far beyond this parking lot. All she knew was that she had done what was right. And sometimes, that's the only thing that matters. Morning sunlight slipped through the torn curtains of Sienna Clark's apartment, thin and pale like it had lost its strength on the way in. The air carried the faint scent of detergent and dust. The place was small, one room pretending to be three. A couch that sagged in the middle, a table with one leg held up by an old book, a refrigerator that hummed louder than it cooled. Sienna moved quietly so she wouldn't wake Maya too soon. She opened the cupboard, reached for the cereal box, and frowned. Just a handful left. She shook the milk carton. A few drops swirled at the bottom. That was all. She poured what little there was into a chipped bowl and set it on the table, adding a few crackers to make it look like more. When Maya wandered out in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, Sienna greeted her with a soft smile that tried to hide everything. "Morning, baby." "Morning, Mommy." Maya climbed onto the chair, swinging her legs. "You're not eating." "I'm not hungry," Sienna lied, turning away so her daughter wouldn't see her swallow hard. Maya started eating without complaint. She never did. Sienna watched her for a long moment, memorizing the way her curls caught the light, the way her small hands cupped the spoon like it was something precious. That image alone gave her enough strength to keep moving. Outside, the street was already alive with traffic and noise. She tied her sneakers, the sole of the left one barely hanging on, and began the 2-mile walk to the laundromat. Her breath made small clouds in the cool morning air. Every step was a reminder of everything she was holding together, barely. At the laundromat, the hum of machines filled the silence. The smell of soap and fabric softener mixed with the scent of exhaustion. Sienna folded clothes one after another, her hands moving automatically. Jeans, towels, sheets. Repeat. Her body ached, her feet screamed, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. A middle-aged white woman tossed a pile of laundry onto the counter with a roll of her eyes. "Fold them right this time," she snapped. Sienna blinked, then nodded gently. "Yes, ma'am." No edge in her voice, no bitterness. Just calm. It wasn't that she didn't feel it, she just couldn't afford to. Linda, her coworker, watched from the back. She'd been working there for 20 years, a heavy-set black woman with laugh lines that had forgotten how to laugh. "You let people walk all over you, honey," Linda said quietly when the customer left. "You give too much. One day, the world might take it all." Sienna smiled, tired but kind. "Then I'll just have to give slower." Linda shook her head. "That's not how the world works." "Maybe it should be," Sienna said. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The dryers rumbled like distant thunder. That was the rhythm of Sienna's life: noise, work, silence, repeat. At 2 o'clock she clocked out, feet throbbing, back sore, and walked to her second job at the diner. There she poured coffee, carried trays, and listened to stories that weren't hers. Men talked loud about football. Women complained about their husbands. No one looked at her long enough to see the fatigue behind her smile. Sometimes, she caught herself watching families eat, wondering what it felt like to sit down without counting dollars first. When her shift ended, she walked home again under a pink and orange sky. Her reflection appeared briefly in the diner window, faded uniform, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back too tight. She barely recognized herself. The city buzzed around her, but she moved through it like a ghost. By the time she reached home, Maya was asleep on the couch with a coloring book on her chest. Sienna lifted her gently, tucked her into bed, and kissed her forehead. "Good night, baby." In the quiet that followed, the loneliness hit hardest. She sat at the small table by the window, opened her worn journal, and wrote slowly in careful handwriting, "Grateful for Maya. For today. For still standing." She closed the notebook and pressed her palm against the cover for a moment, as if sealing the thought inside. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, another reminder of a world that never stopped moving. But inside, there was peace, a small, stubborn peace that came from doing what was right, even when no one was watching. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet strength, this grace under struggle, was the same force that would drive her to spend her last $8 without hesitation. What she did that night wasn't an impulse. It was who she'd been all along. The rain had started as a whisper, a fine mist falling over the empty road, turning the pavement into a sheet of dark glass. Sienna Clark walked alone, her reflection moving with her under the flickering streetlights. The diner had closed hours ago. Her feet ached, her hands smelled faintly of coffee and bleach, and the world felt heavy with silence. She pulled her thin jacket tighter, the hood too small to keep the drizzle from finding her hair. When she reached the gas station, the fluorescent lights hummed like a tired heartbeat. She planned only to stop for the restroom, maybe warm up under the bright canopy before walking the last stretch home. But then she heard it, the sound of metal scraping, a strangled gasp, a curse swallowed by pain. She turned. Under the far light, a man stumbled backward, one hand gripping his chest. His motorcycle leaned sideways, chrome gleaming wet. He was huge, broad shoulders, arms covered in dark ink, a leather vest marked with patches and a skull with wings. The kind of man most people crossed the street to avoid. His eyes widened, his knees buckled, and he went down hard. "Sir." Sienna's voice barely carried over the rain. He didn't answer. He lay on his back, chest heaving. The gas station attendant pushed open the door, cigarette glowing between his fingers. "Don't get involved, lady. I'm serious. You don't want trouble with his kind." Sienna's breath caught. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone. 1 bar of signal. 9% battery. She dialed 911. The call dropped before she could speak. She tried again. Nothing. Her hands shook. "Come on," she whispered to the phone. The clerk shouted, "I told you, leave him. They're all criminals anyway." An old trucker stepped out of the store behind him, his boots splashing in puddles. He looked at Sienna, kind eyes lined with years of road fatigue. "Don't get involved, miss," he said softly. "You got a kid, don't you? Go home." Sienna froze. The man on the ground groaned, the sound low and fading. Her thoughts raced. Maya. The rent. The $8 left in her pocket. And yet, as she stared down at the stranger, something in her shifted. Her grandmother's words echoed again, quiet but firm. "Kindness costs nothing, baby. Sometimes it's all we got." She dropped to her knees. The pavement was slick and cold, soaking through her jeans. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, weak pulse, fading fast. "Sir, stay with me." His lips moved, a dry whisper escaping. "Heart, meds, forgot." Sienna looked around helplessly. The trucker had already turned away. The clerk disappeared back inside. The street was empty. The rain grew heavier. She exhaled, steadying herself, then sprinted inside. The clerk frowned as she burst through the door. "You again." She grabbed a bottle of aspirin and a bottle of water, slammed them on the counter. $6.50, he muttered. She handed him her last $8, the crumpled bills damp from the rain, grabbed the change, and ran. Kneeling beside the man again, she twisted the cap off the aspirin, shook 2 tablets into her palm, and lifted his head slightly. "Can you hear me?" His eyes flickered open. She placed the tablets on his tongue. "Chew them. Please. Chew." He obeyed weakly. She held the water to his lips, helping him drink. "Good. Just breathe." Her voice was calm, even though her heart pounded so loud it filled her ears. The rain softened to a steady rhythm around them, the world shrinking to the small circle of light above the gas pump. His breathing slowed but steadied. Then his hand lifted, large and heavy, finding hers. His grip was faint but firm enough to stop her breath. His eyes met hers, steel gray, clouded with pain. "What's your name?" he rasped. "Sienna. Sienna Clark." He nodded slightly, his lips trembling as he forced the words out. "Tell them. Hawk sent you." Sienna frowned, confused. "Who?" But his eyes had already rolled back. "Hey! Stay with me," she shouted. In the distance, faint sirens began to wail, red and blue lights flashing across the wet street. Relief flooded through her chest. She squeezed his hand. "Hold on. Help's coming." Tires screeched nearby. Another motorcycle roared into the lot. A younger man jumped off, his leather vest marked with the same symbol. He saw the fallen man and his face went white. "Hawk! Oh my God!" He dropped beside them. "What happened?" "Heart attack," Sienna said, out of breath. "I gave him aspirin. The ambulance is almost here." The young biker looked at her in disbelief. You helped him?" She nodded. "He needed help. That's all." For a long second he just stared at her, as if trying to understand why anyone would do that. Then he looked down at the man and whispered, "You just saved someone, who changes lives." The sirens grew louder, splashing red across their faces. Paramedics rushed over, kneeling beside Hawk, checking vitals, asking questions. One of them glanced at the open aspirin bottle. "You give him this?" "2 tablets," she answered. The medic nodded, impressed. "You might have just bought him time." Sienna sat back, drenched, trembling, her hands still covered in rain and adrenaline. She looked at Hawk, this stranger with tattoos and scars and a name that suddenly carried weight. She didn't know who he was, or what "Tell them Hawk sent you" was supposed to mean. But as the ambulance doors closed and the sirens pulled away into the storm, one thought stayed with her. She had risked everything she had, her safety, her last $8, to save a man no one else would touch. She didn't know it yet, but this night, this small act of courage, was the moment everything in her life began to change. Morning crept slowly into the small apartment, soft light filtering through the thin curtains. The clock read 7 o'clock when the knock came, firm, sharp, impatient. Sienna Clark froze halfway through tying her shoes. Maya was still asleep in the next room, her little arm dangling off the bed. The knock came again. "Sienna, baby, open this door," a familiar voice called. "Mrs. Johnson." Her neighbor. Her tone carried the weight of both concern and judgment. Sienna opened the door, still in her diner uniform from the night before. Mrs. Johnson stood there with arms crossed, her floral robe pulled tight, gray hair pinned neatly. "Lord have mercy," she muttered. "I heard you helped one of those Hell's Angels last night." Sienna blinked, confused. "How did you?" "Don't matter how I know," Mrs. Johnson interrupted. "Word travels. People saw the ambulance, saw that motorcycle. Those men bring death, Sienna. They ain't the kind to thank you. They're the kind to bring trouble to your doorstep." Sienna rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pressing down like a weight. "He was dying, Mrs. Johnson. I had to help." "You got a child," the older woman snapped, lowering her voice. "You think kindness keeps you safe from people like that? Baby, the world don't work that way." For a moment, Sienna couldn't speak. She looked down at her shoes, the left one still torn, the rain stains from last night still visible. "He needed help," she said quietly. "That's all I saw." Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "You're too soft-hearted. One day, that softness will cost you more than you can afford." Then she turned and walked back across the hall, slippers shuffling against the floor, the sound fading like a warning carried away on the wind. Sienna stood there, door half open, staring into the morning light spilling across the floor. From the street below, voices drifted up. two neighbors talking in hushed tones. "That's her," one said. "The woman from last night. Helping those biker thugs," the other whispered. "You'll see, something bad's coming." Curtains moved in nearby windows. People looking without looking. Pretending not to watch. Sienna closed the door slowly and leaned against it, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath, looked at the small apartment around her, the cereal box on the table, Maya's tiny shoes by the door. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. That afternoon, at the laundromat, the rhythm of folding clothes felt heavier than usual. The sound of machines filled the silence, but her mind replayed every word Mrs. Johnson had said. Linda noticed the tension right away. "You look like you ain't slept," she said, sliding into the chair beside her. "You all right?" Sienna hesitated, then told her everything: the biker, the heart attack, the last $8, the ambulance. Linda's eyes widened. "You helped a Hell's Angel?" Sienna nodded slowly. "I guess so." "Girl," Linda said, shaking her head, "that's the bravest and the craziest thing I ever heard." Sienna gave a small smile. "Mrs. Johnson doesn't think it's brave." Linda snorted. "Mrs. Johnson been scared of the world since it started turning. You did what your heart told you. Don't let fear rewrite it." Those words landed deep, but they didn't silence the doubt. Fear had a way of creeping in when things got too quiet. That night, after Maya fell asleep, Sienna sat by the window, the city hummed soft outside. The rain had stopped. The streets glistened under the streetlights. She glanced up, and froze. Across the road, under the shadow of a flickering lamp, two figures stood beside their motorcycles. Black leather vests, the same emblem she had seen on Hawk's chest, a crown with wings. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing her building. Watching. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She reached for her phone but stopped halfway. The figures exchanged a look, then swung their legs over the bikes. Engines roared softly, and they disappeared into the night. The silence they left behind was louder than the sound itself. Sienna's hands shook as she pulled her worn jacket closer. Her eyes fell on the small white business card lying on the table. Crown with wings. The same logo. She stared at it for a long time. She could throw it away and pretend none of this ever happened. Or she could call. Her thumb hovered over the number. She hesitated, heart pounding, every instinct warning her to stay away. But then she thought of that man's hand clutching hers, his voice whispering through the rain. "Tell them Hawk sent you." She took a breath, opened her phone, and typed a single message. "This is Sienna Clark." Her finger paused for just a second. Then she hit send. The screen glowed in the dark, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a chill run down her spine, as if somewhere out there, in a hospital room she couldn't see, her message had just awakened something far bigger than she could imagine. The sun was dipping low when Sienna Clark stepped off the bus on 5th Street. The late afternoon light spilled across the asphalt like liquid gold, catching the chrome of a long row of motorcycles parked neatly outside Murphy's diner. She stopped on the sidewalk, staring. There must have been 40 of them, black and silver machines lined up in perfect formation, each one gleaming as if polished for a ceremony. The air vibrated with quiet tension, the kind that came before something you couldn't quite name. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Every instinct screamed to turn around. She wasn't supposed to be here. These weren't her people. But something stronger kept her feet rooted to the ground. She took a breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the diner was silent. The clink of a spoon or murmur of conversation that usually filled the place was gone. Every booth, every stool, every corner was occupied by bikers in black leather vests. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching on metal studs, belt buckles, rings, and the faint smoke of coffee rising from untouched cups. When Sienna stepped in, every head turned. For a moment, she froze in the doorway, too aware of her faded jeans, her frayed jacket, the nervous tremor in her hands. Then a familiar voice came from the back. "Sienna," Cole called softly, a small smile breaking through the tension. "He's been waiting for you." Cole moved through the crowd toward her, and something strange happened as he did. One by one, the bikers began to stand. Not with aggression, not to intimidate, but like soldiers acknowledging a general. The sound of chairs scraping the floor filled the diner in unison. Sienna's breath caught. She didn't understand what she was walking into, but she felt the gravity of it. Cole guided her through the narrow path between tables. Every man and woman she passed gave her a small nod, some lowering their eyes in quiet respect. It felt unreal. Like walking through a scene that didn't belong to her. At the far corner booth sat the man she had last seen gasping for breath on cold pavement. Hawk. His beard was trimmed now, his skin less pale, but the oxygen lines still clung to his nose. He looked fragile, yet his presence filled the room. When their eyes met, he smiled faintly. "Sienna Clark," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Please. Sit." She hesitated, then slid into the seat across from him. Cole stood nearby, hands clasped in front of him. Hawk leaned back, studying her face for a long moment before speaking again. "You saved my life," he said simply. "The doctors told me if you hadn't acted when you did, I wouldn't be sitting here." Sienna shook her head. "I just did what anyone would do." Hawk's smile deepened, tinged with sadness. "No, ma'am. Most people would have walked away. Especially from someone like me." His eyes drifted toward the window where the motorcycles shimmered in the fading light. "You didn't see the patches or the tattoos. You saw a human being. That's rare." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, sliding it across the table. The edges were creased, the colors faded with time. A little girl, maybe 7, grinned up at the camera. Her head was bald, her hospital gown dotted with cartoon stars. Next to her stood a younger version of Hawk, his arm around her shoulders. Sienna's throat tightened. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Hawk's jaw tensed, his voice softened. "Her name was Lily. My daughter. Leukemia. We fought as hard as we could, but," he paused, blinking back something heavy. "We couldn't afford treatment in time. By the time the money came, it was too late." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Sienna looked down at the photo, her fingers brushing the corner. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. Hawk nodded, his gaze far away. "When she passed, I made her a promise. I told her that every act of kindness I saw in this world, I'd make it bigger. That I'd turn it into something that lived on." He took a slow breath. "That's what we do now. Lily's legacy. We're not a gang. We're a family. We ride to find people like you, the ones who give when they've got nothing left. And we help them." Sienna stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. Lily's legacy. The word sounded almost sacred. "So all of this," she began, glancing around at the silent room full of bikers, "is for her?" Hawk smiled faintly. "For her. And for people like you." He took another sip of coffee, hands trembling slightly. "You spent your last $8 on a stranger, not knowing who he was. Tomorrow morning, you'll understand what kindness builds." Sienna frowned. "What do you mean?" Hawk just smiled again, a secret folded behind his eyes. "You'll see." He pushed the photo back toward her. "Keep it. Remind yourself that even the smallest act can carry someone 1,000 miles." She hesitated, then took the picture gently, slipping it into her pocket. Around them, the light shifted. The last of the sun's glow cast long shadows across the chrome outside. The bikers began to relax, the low murmur of conversation returning. Hawk stood slowly, his movements stiff but deliberate. Thank you for coming, Sienna Clark, he said. Tomorrow, you'll see why I had to meet you in person. He extended his hand. She shook it, feeling the roughness of his palm, the weight of something unspoken between them. Then Hawk turned and walked toward the door, Cole following close behind. The rest of the bikers parted quietly, letting them through. Sienna sat there long after they were gone, the hum of the diner slowly returning to normal. She glanced down at the photograph again, at the little girl's smile frozen in time. She didn't know what Hawk meant by tomorrow. But for the first time in years, she felt something stir deep in her chest, a fragile flicker of hope. The sound came before the sight of it, a low thunder rolling through the narrow streets of the neighborhood. Sienna Clark woke with a start, her heart pounding before her mind could make sense of what she was hearing. The windows rattled. The floor trembled. Outside, engines roared in perfect rhythm, deep and steady like a heartbeat. She rushed to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Her breath caught. The entire street was lined with motorcycles. Dozens, then hundreds. Chrome gleaming under the morning sun, exhaust pipes steaming in the cool air. Men and women in leather vests stood beside their bikes in silent formation. Black jackets. Silver patches. The same crown with wings emblem she had seen on Hawk's chest. The same one she had seen in her dreams all night. Maya ran into the room, clutching her stuffed bear. "Mommy, what's happening? Why are there so many motorcycles?" Sienna didn't have an answer. She just stared. Engines rumbled like thunder trapped in the street. Curtains flew open across the block as neighbors peeked out. Doors creaked. Then the shouting began. "Oh Lord, it's them," Mrs. Johnson cried from her porch, hand clutching her chest. "You brought a gang here, Sienna." Mr. Rodriguez from next door stormed out barefoot, waving his arms. "This is a neighborhood, not a biker rally." "Call the police," someone yelled. Phones were already in hands. Maya pressed against Sienna's leg, eyes wide, tears forming. "Mommy, I'm scared." Sienna knelt, holding her close, whispering, "It's okay, baby. It's okay." But even she wasn't sure if it was. Then, through the roar of engines, a voice cut through the air. Calm, firm, commanding. "Folks, please. No one's here to hurt anyone." Cole stepped forward, hands raised, standing in the middle of the street. His presence quieted the noise little by little. The engines began to die down one by one until only silence remained. The crowd of neighbors stared at him, suspicious, afraid. "We're not here for trouble," Cole continued. "We're here to thank someone." Murmurs rippled through the block. From the crowd, Mrs. Johnson's voice rose, trembling with anger and fear. "Thank someone? For what? For bringing fear to our doorsteps?" Cole didn't respond. Instead, he turned and looked toward the far end of the street. The sound of another engine roared closer, a deep, steady rumble that silenced everything else. A large black motorcycle rolled slowly through the crowd, splitting the sea of people like something out of a dream. On it sat Hawk. He looked smaller than before but carried the kind of weight that made people step back without knowing why. His vest caught the sunlight, and when he parked, the entire line of bikers stood straighter. Hawk removed his helmet, breathing in the morning air. Then he spoke, his voice deep, carrying across the block with a quiet power. "You see these men and women? You see these bikes?" He paused, looking around at the fearful faces staring back at him. "You think we're here for chaos. But we're here because one woman, one mother, saw a dying man on the ground and didn't walk away." He turned toward Sienna, who stood frozen at her door, holding Maya's hand. Hawk pointed gently at her. "She spent her last $8 to save my life. Now, we'll spend the rest of ours helping hers." The street went still. For a moment, not even the wind dared to move. Then the trailer behind Hawk's bike opened with a metallic click. Inside were boxes stacked to the roof, groceries, toys, medical supplies, even furniture wrapped in plastic. Cole jumped onto the trailer bed, calling out, "We brought food, medicine, and rent assistance for this whole block. And for Sienna Clark, something more." Two bikers carried out a small envelope and handed it to Sienna. She opened it with shaking hands. A check. $25,000. And beneath it, a letter printed on official letterhead. Lily's legacy. Community Outreach Coordinator, $52,000 a year, full benefits. She blinked, unable to process the words. Hawk stepped closer, his boots heavy on the pavement. He handed her a small metal key. "You saved my life. I'm giving you back yours." Sienna's lips trembled. "I don't understand," she whispered. Hawk smiled softly. "You don't have to. Kindness comes full circle, whether you believe it or not." Behind them, the bikers began unloading boxes. The scent of fresh fruit and bread filled the air. People came out of their houses cautiously. Mr. Rodriguez took a hesitant step forward. "What's all this?" Cole handed him a box labeled Lily's Legacy Food Program. "For everyone who's struggling. Rent, medicine, repairs, we've got it covered. You're part of her story now." The anger on Mr. Rodriguez's face melted into something else. Gratitude. Awe. He nodded slowly, taking the box. Mrs. Johnson stood frozen on her porch, tears welling up in her eyes. "Lord," she whispered. "We judged you wrong." She hurried down the steps and pulled Sienna into a trembling embrace. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I was so wrong about you. About them." Sienna could barely speak. Her voice came out as a whisper. "I just wanted to help." Hawk placed a hand on her shoulder. "And you did. More than you'll ever know." The crowd, once tense and divided, began to shift. Neighbors who'd hidden inside now stepped out to help unload supplies. Children pointed and smiled as bikers handed them toys. The fear that had filled the air just minutes ago turned into laughter, chatter, and the hum of gratitude. The roar of engines returned, but this time it wasn't menacing, it was music. A sound of hope and redemption. Hawk looked around the street, his expression proud but tired. "We're building something here," he said softly. "A world where people see people, not patches. Not skin color. Just hearts." Maya tugged on her mother's sleeve, holding up a small toy bike one of the bikers had given her. "Mommy, they gave me this." Sienna smiled through tears. "They gave us all something, baby." Hawk handed her one last envelope. "Your car, fully repaired. It's around the corner. No more walking in the rain." Sienna covered her mouth, tears streaming freely now. "Why? Why do all this?" Hawk's eyes glistened. "Because 20 years ago, my daughter died while I was trying to find help. No one stopped. You did. And I swore, if I ever got another chance, I'd spend my life honoring people like you." He turned to the crowd. "This woman saved my life with $8. Today, we return it 1,000 times over." The street erupted in applause. Some cried, some laughed, others simply stood in silence, humbled. The engines roared once more, 100 thunderclaps rolling across the block. But this time, it wasn't fear that filled the air, it was faith. Sienna stood in the middle of it all, holding Maya close, the envelope trembling in her hand. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Hawk smiled at her one last time before turning toward his bike. "You showed us what real strength looks like, Sienna. The kind that comes from love." She nodded, unable to speak. As the engines roared again and the bikers rode off into the sunlight, the sound echoed down the street like a heartbeat, loud, steady, alive. A street once filled with judgment had become something else entirely. A street of redemption. A year later, sunlight spilled across the glass doors of Clark House, the new community center that stood where cracked pavement and broken fences used to be. The air buzzed with laughter, with life. Children ran through the courtyard, chasing balloons. Inside, volunteers arranged boxes of groceries, families lined up for checkups, and neighbors who once hid behind curtains now worked side by side. On the front wall, a small bronze plaque caught the light. Built on $8 of kindness. Sienna Clark stood at the podium, her voice steady but full of emotion. Kindness, she said, looking out at the crowd, is never a mistake. Even when it costs you everything. The room went quiet. Hawk stood in the back, cane in hand, pride glowing in his eyes. Cole smiled beside him. Mrs. Johnson, once the first to judge, now wore a Lily's Legacy vest, handing out food with her sleeves rolled up. Maya sat in the front row, beaming at her mother. When Sienna finished speaking, applause filled the hall, echoing off the new walls. The ribbon stretched across the entrance shimmered red in the sunlight. Sienna, Hawk, Cole, and Maya stood together holding the scissors. Ready? Hawk said. Sienna nodded. They cut the ribbon at once, the crowd erupting in cheers. For a moment, everything felt still, the noise, the laughter, the sunlight, all blending into something that felt like peace. That evening, as the celebration ended, Sienna walked home under a soft purple sky. The air was cool, the streets quiet. She passed a small gas station, its fluorescent lights humming like old memories. Then she saw him, a young man sitting on the curb beside a broken-down car. His hands covered his face, shoulders shaking. Sienna hesitated, then stepped closer. You okay? The man looked up, startled. His eyes were red. My car died. I'm broke. My son's waiting at daycare, and I can't even call a tow. Sienna reached into her bag and pulled out $50, folded neatly, and a white card with a crown and wings printed on it. Here, she said softly. Fix your car. Then pass it on. The man stared, speechless. Ma'am, I can't. Yes, you can, she said. You don't have to know me. Just help the next person when it's your turn. She placed the money in his hand, gave him the card, and smiled. Then she turned and walked away, the wind lifting her hair, the sound of distant engines humming somewhere far off. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. A year ago, she'd been the one kneeling on cold pavement with nothing but $8 and a choice. Tonight, she was the one giving someone else that same chance. The narrator's voice lingers over the quiet street. 1 year ago, she had $8 and a choice. Today, she gives others the same chance. Who can you help today? If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.